In the Gilded Age, a garden could confess what its owner never dared to say aloud. A single rose placed too close to a pathway, a wilted bloom left unremoved, a carefully chosen bouquet sent without a card. These were not accidents, but statements. Among trimmed hedges and manicured lawns, flowers became a silent language of desire, warning, exclusion, and longing, understood instantly by those who belong to this world. Before we step deeper into these carefully staged landscapes, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're watching from. Gardens, like stories, travel farther when shared. This is Gilded Age Gardens, the secret language of floral arrangements, a world where beauty concealed intention, and petals spoke with more precision than words ever could. Long before a single seed was pressed into the soil, the Gilded Age garden had already been decided. It was not conceived as a place of leisure, nor merely as an extension of the home, but as a statement, measured, deliberate, and legible to the correct eyes. In an era governed by restraint, where direct expression was often regarded as indelicate or dangerous, flowers assumed a role once reserved for speech. They did not shout. They suggested. They did not accuse. They implied. The social world of the Gilded Age demanded fluency in absence. Feelings were expected to be contained, rivalries softened into civility, and desires routed through acceptable forms. Words once spoken could be repeated, misquoted, or remembered too clearly. Flowers, by contrast, possessed the advantage of ambiguity. A bloom could be admired without being acknowledged. Its presence could be noted without being discussed. And yet, to those trained in its language, nothing about it was vague. This was the quiet power of floral expression. A garden allowed one to communicate without ever appearing to do so. It offered a medium that was both visible and deniable, open to interpretation, yet governed by shared conventions. To cultivate a garden was not simply to tend to beauty, but to arrange meaning. Choice of species, color, abundance, and placement formed a vocabulary that spoke to visitors as they moved through gravel paths and trimmed hedges. Each turn offered a sentence. Each bed suggested emphasis or restraint. The rise of this silent language was not accidental. The Gilded Age was defined by social mobility that outpaced social clarity. New fortunes appeared rapidly, often without the cultural grounding that older elites prized. Gardens became one of the few spaces where refinement could be demonstrated without explanation. To plant correctly was to signal belonging. To plant incorrectly was to reveal impatience, ignorance, or excess. Floral literacy thus became a form of quiet gatekeeping, welcoming to those who understood, impenetrable to those who did not. In these spaces, flowers took on the burden of emotional labor. Gratitude could be expressed through careful abundance. Displeasure could be indicated by omission. Sympathy was measured in muted tones rather than overt displays. Even affection, when permitted, was routed through botanical symbolism rather than direct admission. The garden absorbed what could not safely be said indoors. It became a buffer between inner feeling and outer expectation. Importantly, this language did not require universal agreement, only shared familiarity. Its strength lay in its partial secrecy. A visitor might admire a garden without sensing its undertones, while another would register its messages immediately and with precision. This duality protected both sender and recipient. Nothing could be proven. Nothing needed to be acknowledged. Meaning existed, but only where it was recognized. The garden therefore functioned as a social text, read slowly, absorbed unconsciously, and rarely discussed outright. Its messages unfolded over time, reinforced by repetition and seasonal return. Unlike spoken words, which vanished once uttered, floral arrangements lingered. They could be revisited, they could be adjusted. A single change, a bloom removed, a color altered, could revise the message entirely without drawing attention to the act itself. In this way, flowers replaced words not because they were clearer, but because they were safer. They allowed emotion to be expressed within acceptable boundaries, wrapped in beauty and discipline. They carried meaning without accountability. And in a society where appearance was currency and discretion a survival skill, that made them indispensable. Thus, the Gilded Age garden was never silent. It spoke constantly, softly, deliberately, and only to those who knew how to listen. The Gilded Age garden did not originate in American soil. It arrived already shaped, carried across the Atlantic in books, engravings, seeds, and expectations. What was imported was not merely botanical knowledge, but a philosophy of restraint. European gardens, long associated with aristocratic order and inherited power, offered a model for how space itself could be disciplined into meaning. In adopting these forms, American elites were not imitating beauty alone. They were importing silence. The formal gardens of England and the continent had been designed to suppress spontaneity. Paths followed strict geometry. Hedges were trimmed into obedience. Growth was permitted only when controlled. This aesthetic, refined over centuries of entrenched hierarchy, translated easily into a society newly anxious about legitimacy. For those whose wealth was recent and whose social standing remained under scrutiny, European garden traditions offered something invaluable: a visual language already accepted as authoritative. Yet this silence was selective. European gardens had been shaped by generations who understood their codes intuitively. In the Gilded Age, those same forms were often adopted by individuals still learning the rules they hoped to display. The result was a landscape that appeared confident while remaining deeply self-conscious. Every imported style carried with it an implicit comparison between old money and new, between inherited ease and purchased refinement. Garden manuals circulated widely, offering instruction not just on planting, but on propriety, which flowers belonged near the house, which were suitable only for distant beds, which colors suggested taste, and which risked vulgarity. These guides rarely explained why certain choices mattered. They assumed agreement. Silence, again, was part of the lesson. To follow the rules without questioning them was itself a mark of cultivation. European influence also shaped what was excluded. Native plants, abundant and resilient, were often regarded as insufficiently refined. Their familiarity undermined the performance of cosmopolitan taste. Imported species, fragile, demanding, sometimes ill-suited to the climate, became symbols of effort and expense. Their survival signaled control. Their presence suggested that no inconvenience had been spared to achieve the desired effect. This preference reinforced a particular kind of quiet authority. A garden modeled on European ideals implied not only wealth, but patience, planning, and continuity. Even when transplanted into American soil, these designs gestured backward to lineage, tradition, and an unbroken cultural thread. The garden thus became a way to simulate depth of history where none yet existed. Yet the silence imported with these styles was not neutral. It imposed hierarchy on space. Visitors were guided where to walk, where to pause, where to admire. Certain views were revealed gradually, others concealed entirely. The garden instructed its audience without appearing to do so. It rewarded attentiveness and punished haste. To rush through was to miss the message. To linger incorrectly was to reveal unfamiliarity. In adopting these traditions, Gilded Age households also absorbed their constraints. Emotion was subordinated to symmetry. Excess was tolerated only when justified by precedent. Innovation risked misinterpretation. As a result, many gardens became exercises in careful restraint, echoing European forms even as they adapted to American settings. The silence they projected was deliberate, an assurance that nothing improper would surface here. And yet, beneath this imported calm, tension persisted. The very act of imitation carried anxiety. To reproduce European silence required constant vigilance. Every bloom, every pruning decision threatened to betray insecurity or misunderstanding. The garden, outwardly serene, became a site of quiet labor, maintaining not just plants, but credibility. Thus, the European garden tradition did more than influence Gilded Age aesthetics. It taught a way of withholding. It normalized the idea that meaning should be encoded rather than declared. And in doing so, it provided the framework through which American gardens would learn to speak, softly, selectively, and always under the cover of cultivated restraint. In the Gilded Age, appearances were not superficial. They were structural. Society relied upon them to maintain order where certainty was lacking. Wealth could be sudden, lineage ambiguous, and reputations fragile. In this environment, the garden assumed a role far greater than ornamentation. It became a stabilizing facade, an external assurance that what lay within the household was orderly, disciplined, and worthy of regard. Unlike interiors, which were revealed selectively and to chosen company, gardens were perpetually visible. They announced themselves before a word was exchanged or a threshold crossed. A passerby needed no invitation to observe them. Their condition, composition, and restraint spoke continuously, offering judgments before introductions could soften them. This visibility made the garden uniquely valuable as a tool of social signaling and uniquely dangerous if mishandled. To cultivate appearances was therefore an act of vigilance. A neglected border suggested carelessness. Overabundance hinted at vulgar display. Improper combinations betrayed ignorance rather than enthusiasm. The garden demanded constant correction, its beauty dependent not on passion, but on control. Growth itself had to be managed so that it appeared effortless. Labor was concealed. The result was meant to look inevitable. This emphasis on appearance was not merely aesthetic. It reflected a broader moral framework in which outward order implied inward virtue. A well-governed garden suggested a well-governed household. Discipline in planting mirrored discipline in conduct. Regularity of form implied reliability of character. These assumptions were rarely spoken aloud, yet they shaped judgment with quiet force. Crucially, the garden allowed for performance without exposure. One could demonstrate refinement without revealing personal feeling. Emotional life remained private, while aesthetic choices performed stability. In this way, gardens functioned as protective layers, absorbing scrutiny that might otherwise be directed inward. They deflected attention, offering beauty in place of confession. The cultivation of appearances also introduced a careful hierarchy of attention. Certain elements were designed to be noticed immediately. Symmetrical entrances, prominent beds, restrained color palettes near the house. Other features revealed themselves gradually, if at all. This pacing mirrored social interaction. What was most visible was most controlled. What lay deeper required familiarity and patience. The garden trained its observer in proper engagement. Even change had to be managed discreetly. Seasonal transitions were expected, but abrupt alterations risked commentary. A sudden redesign invited speculation. Gradual evolution suggested continuity. Thus, gardens were rarely allowed to reflect personal shifts or emotional upheaval. They maintained composure even when the household did not. Their steadiness offered reassurance, both to observers and to those who relied upon them. This cultivated surface also masked inequality. Beneath manicured lawns lay intensive labor, often performed by individuals whose presence was deliberately minimized. The success of the appearance depended on their invisibility. Order was preserved by hands never acknowledged. The garden, in its calm, concealed both effort and imbalance. Its serenity was curated, not natural. Yet despite, or because of, this artifice, gardens held extraordinary power. They could rehabilitate reputations, soften suspicion, and invite inclusion. A household uncertain of its standing could stabilize perception through consistent cultivation. Over time, familiarity replaced doubt. The garden performed respectability until it was accepted as fact. In this way, the Gilded Age garden did more than decorate the landscape. It rehearsed legitimacy. It trained both owner and observer to accept surfaces as evidence. And in a society where appearances often determined outcomes, long before truths were known, that cultivation was not optional, it was essential. In the Gilded Age garden, movement was never incidental. The visitor's eye, and by extension, the visitor's judgment, was guided with deliberate care. Paths were laid not simply to connect spaces, but to choreograph perception. Where one walked, where one paused, and what one saw first were all carefully arranged long before any guest arrived. The garden did not reveal itself at once. It instructed. Straight paths conveyed confidence and authority. Their clarity suggested decisiveness, order, and an absence of hesitation. Curved paths, by contrast, implied refinement and restraint. They slowed progress, encouraged contemplation, and delayed revelation. Neither choice was neutral. Each communicated temperament, intention, and social aspiration. To select a path design was to choose how one wished to be perceived. These routes determined more than physical direction. They shaped emotional response. A gradual approach to a central feature heightened anticipation. A sudden opening into a wider space created controlled surprise. Narrow passages induced quiet attentiveness, while broad avenues invited display. The garden thus managed not only sightlines, but mood. Visitors were led into states of calm, admiration, or reflection without realizing they had been guided there. Importantly, paths also structured hierarchy. Certain routes were meant for casual viewing, others for intimate exploration. Guests unfamiliar with the household might remain confined to the main walkways, absorbing only what was intended for public impression. Those invited deeper were rewarded with subtler details. Rare plantings, secluded benches, arrangements requiring explanation or familiarity. The garden distinguished between levels of belonging without requiring explicit acknowledgement. This quiet segregation reinforced social boundaries. Knowledge of where to walk and where not to signaled cultural fluency. A misstep could be revealing. Lingering too long in a private corner suggested presumption. Moving too quickly through a designed pause betrayed impatience. The garden tested its visitors gently, offering opportunities to demonstrate ease or expose uncertainty. Even the maintenance of paths carried meaning. Gravel kept meticulously raked suggested vigilance and discipline. Overgrown edges hinted at neglect or intentional informality, depending on context. Clean lines spoke of control. Soft borders suggested cultivated leisure. Each choice communicated values as clearly as any spoken introduction. Paths also controlled what remained unseen. Service areas, labor zones, and practical necessities were often concealed by strategic routing. The visitor's journey was curated to exclude disorder. The garden thus performed an edited reality, one in which effort disappeared and elegance appeared self-sustaining. What was hidden mattered as much as what was displayed. This direction of the eye extended to temporal experience as well. Repeated visits reinforced familiarity, yet subtle changes altered emphasis. A path that once led the eye to early blooms might later frame autumn color. The route remained constant. The message evolved. This allowed communication without disruption, continuity with variation, change without announcement. Ultimately, the path was a sentence written in stone and soil. It told the visitor how to look, when to pause, and what to value. It suggested pace, encouraged restraint, and rewarded attention. To walk it correctly was to read the garden fluently. To stray was to risk misinterpretation. In the Gilded Age, where appearances were constructed with care and meaning, often concealed behind beauty. Paths served as silent narrators. They directed the eye, shaped judgment, and ensured that what was seen and what was not aligned precisely with intention. In the Gilded Age garden, proximity was carefully regulated. Flower beds were arranged not for intimacy, but for observation. They invited admiration while discouraging familiarity. This distance was not accidental. It reflected a broader social logic in which access was controlled and appreciation was permitted only from the proper remove. To look was acceptable, to touch was not. Raised beds, low borders, and subtle barriers established invisible boundaries. They delineated where the visitor might stand and where the garden itself began. These separations preserved both the plants and the performance. A bed kept just beyond reach retained its authority. Its beauty remained intact, untested by handling, unaltered by impulse. The garden asked to be read, not interfered with. This emphasis on observation mirrored social norms of the era. Emotional engagement was expected to be internal, measured, and restrained. Just as conversation avoided overt intimacy, so too did the garden resist physical closeness. Flowers were to be appreciated visually, their meanings absorbed quietly. Touch implied familiarity. Familiarity implied entitlement. Neither was freely granted. The arrangement of beds reinforced this ethic. Formal symmetry created balance without invitation. Dense planting discouraged intrusion. Fragile species were placed where their delicacy could be admired but not endangered. Each choice affirmed that beauty was something to be respected from a distance. The garden thus modeled proper behavior as clearly as any etiquette manual. This distance also preserved ambiguity. A flower admired from afar could retain multiple meanings. Up close, it might reveal imperfections, wilting petals, bruised leaves that complicated interpretation. Observation at a remove allowed the message to remain intact. The garden controlled not only access, but clarity. Importantly, this separation was selective. Certain beds, often smaller or less prominent, were designed for closer inspection by those invited to linger. These spaces offered intimacy without exposure. To be guided toward them signaled trust. To reach them uninvited was to overstep. Again, the garden distinguished subtly between levels of belonging. The prohibition against touch extended beyond physical preservation. It reinforced the idea that beauty was not a shared resource, but a curated experience. The garden was not communal. It was presented. Visitors consumed it visually, absorbing its messages without altering its form. Their role was passive, their response internal. Even children were trained into this discipline. Instruction was gentle but firm. Flowers were admired, not plucked. Paths were followed, not crossed. These lessons extended beyond horticulture. They taught restraint, respect for boundaries, and awareness of social order. The garden educated quietly, reinforcing norms through repetition. Yet beneath this restraint lay tension. The desire to touch, to test reality, to claim beauty, was present, even if unacknowledged. The garden's denial of that impulse heightened its authority. By withholding access, it increased desire while maintaining control. The viewer was left with impression rather than possession. In this way, Gilded Age flower beds embodied the era's contradictions. They offered beauty while restricting engagement. They communicated freely while guarding intimacy. They appeared generous, yet remained controlled. To observe without touching became an exercise in discipline, one that mirrored the broader expectations of a society built on appearances, distance, and carefully maintained restraint. In the Gilded Age, knowing flowers was not a pastime. It was a form of education. Botany, stripped of its scientific rigor and recast for social use, became a language one was expected to read fluently without ever appearing to study. Names, seasons, temperaments and associations were absorbed quietly, often early, and carried forward as part of one's cultural equipment. To misidentify a bloom was not merely an error of knowledge, it was a lapse in belonging. This literacy was rarely taught directly. It was learned through exposure, repetition, and observation. Children absorbed it from gardens they walked through daily, from books left casually on tables, from remarks made and not explained. Guests learned it through embarrassment or approval, depending on how accurately they responded to what was placed before them. Praise was subtle, correction was quieter still. The lesson lingered. Flowers carried reputations. Some were admired for restraint, others for excess. Certain species suggested patience and steadiness, others restlessness or vanity. These judgments were not written in any single guide, yet they were widely shared. A knowledgeable observer could glance at a garden and infer not only taste, but temperament and aspiration. Botany became shorthand for character. Importantly, this knowledge was cumulative. It rewarded those raised within its orbit and disadvantaged those who arrived later. New wealth could purchase land and labor, but cultural fluency required time. The garden thus functioned as a test that money alone could not easily pass. A single inappropriate planting could undo months of careful presentation. Too many rare specimens suggested insecurity. Too few suggested ignorance. Balance was everything, and balance required familiarity. The expectation of botanical literacy extended beyond private gardens into public and semi-public spaces. Flowers at dinners, in entryways, at social events were all read for meaning. An arrangement that appeared careless could cast doubt on the host's judgment. An overly assertive display risked attracting commentary. Even neutrality required skill. To appear effortless was the highest achievement. This literacy also allowed communication to occur without consent. One could send a message through flowers without announcing the act. The recipient, if equally fluent, would understand immediately. Others might notice nothing at all. This selective comprehension reinforced social bonds among those who shared the code. It also preserved deniability, meaning existed, but only where it was recognized. The power of this system lay in its informality. There were no examinations, no certificates, no explicit standards. Yet failure was noted. Absence of knowledge marked one as unseasoned or careless. Excessive display marked one as trying too hard. Mastery revealed itself only through restraint. The most adept never appeared to choose. Their selections seemed inevitable. Botanical literacy also intersected with gendered expectations. Women were often assumed to possess this knowledge intuitively, as an extension of domestic responsibility. Men were expected to recognize it without appearing invested. The garden thus became a site where cultural competence was performed differently, yet evaluated by the same standards. Everyone was reading, even if no one admitted it. Over time, this quiet education shaped perception. Flowers ceased to be neutral objects. They became signals, references, and reminders. To walk through a garden was to move through a field of meanings that had been agreed upon without discussion. The uninitiated saw beauty. The initiated saw structure, intention, and judgment layered beneath. In the Gilded Age, to know flowers was to know where one stood. Botany, practiced as cultural literacy, offered no refuge in innocence. It demanded attention, memory, and discretion. And once learned, it could not be unlearned. Every bloom thereafter spoke, whether one wished to listen or not. There existed in the Gilded Age a peculiar agreement that was never signed and never spoken aloud. Everyone understood that flowers carried meaning. Everyone participated in arranging, receiving, and observing them. And yet, no one openly acknowledged that a language was being used at all. This collective pretense was not hypocrisy. It was strategy. To admit that flowers spoke would have required admitting that people listened, and listening, in a society built on discretion, implied vulnerability. It suggested emotional awareness, judgment, and response. Instead, the fiction was maintained that flowers were simply beautiful objects, chosen for their charm or seasonal suitability. Their meanings were allowed to operate only beneath the surface, where responsibility could not easily be assigned. This denial protected all parties. The sender could claim innocence. The recipient could avoid public reaction. Observers could notice without implicating themselves. The garden thus became a space of plausible deniability, where communication occurred without ownership. Meaning circulated freely, but accountability did not. The effectiveness of this arrangement depended on restraint. Once acknowledged, the language would lose its power. To point out the message would collapse its ambiguity. Silence preserved flexibility. A white bloom might signal sincerity or simply preference. A sparse arrangement might imply disapproval or merely economy. As long as no one named the intention, all interpretations remained possible, yet none enforceable. This collective refusal to name the language created a paradoxical intimacy. Those who understood it shared a private awareness without forming an explicit alliance. Recognition occurred silently, often accompanied by nothing more than a glance or a pause. The acknowledgement was internal, the response equally so. Entire exchanges could pass without a single word, their significance understood only by those involved. At the same time, this silence enforced conformity. To acknowledge the language openly would mark one as disruptive, overly perceptive, or indiscreet. It risked drawing attention to dynamics better left unexamined. Thus, even those most fluent in floral meaning learned to suppress commentary. They performed ignorance as a form of politeness. The denial also reinforced hierarchy. Those unfamiliar with the language were spared embarrassment by not being tested openly. Those fluent could observe without revealing advantage. Knowledge remained invisible, its presence inferred only through correct response. This maintained the appearance of equality while preserving distinction. Importantly, the pretense extended beyond social interactions into written culture. Garden manuals described flowers in terms of care and arrangement, rarely addressing meaning directly. When symbolism was mentioned, it was often framed as quaint tradition rather than active practice. This distancing allowed readers to absorb knowledge without appearing to rely on it. The language was preserved, but its relevance denied. This selective acknowledgement mirrored broader patterns of the era. Many truths were understood, but left unspoken. Social tensions, personal rivalries, and emotional entanglements were managed through implication rather than confrontation. Flowers fit neatly into this system. They allowed expression without escalation, recognition without exposure. Yet the language did not weaken through denial. On the contrary, it thrived. The more it was disavowed, the more carefully it was practiced. Precision increased. Choices became more deliberate. Messages grew subtler. The silence surrounding the language sharpened its effectiveness. In this way, the Gilded Age garden became a theater of unspoken agreement. Everyone played their role. Everyone denied the script. The flowers continued to speak, and the audience continued to listen, all while insisting that nothing at all was being said. In the Gilded Age, gardens were not interpreted solely as aesthetic achievements. They were read as moral texts. Order in planting implied order in conduct. Balance suggested moderation. Excess hinted at indulgence. Neglect raised questions that extended far beyond horticulture. The garden became a visible proxy for character, offering quiet evidence of discipline, judgment, and restraint. This moral reading was rarely articulated, yet widely practiced. Visitors moved through gardens with an unspoken attentiveness, noting symmetry, cleanliness, and care. Straight edges implied control. Repeated patterns suggested reliability. Chaos, even when intentional, risked being interpreted as weakness or carelessness. Nature was expected to submit to design, just as emotion was expected to submit to propriety. The idea that a landscape could reflect virtue was not new, but in the Gilded Age, it acquired particular urgency. Rapid industrial growth had unsettled older assumptions about merit and worth. Wealth no longer guaranteed respectability. Gardens stepped into this uncertainty as stabilizing symbols. They offered a way to demonstrate moral steadiness without declaring it outright. Restraint was the central virtue on display. A garden that resisted spectacle implied a household capable of resisting impulse. Color was measured. Growth was controlled. Decoration was deliberate rather than abundant. These choices suggested an ethic of moderation that extended beyond the grounds themselves. The garden reassured observers that despite modern excess elsewhere, discipline still governed this space. Conversely, deviation attracted attention. Overly elaborate designs invited scrutiny. Unusual combinations provoked quiet speculation. Innovation was tolerated only when it could be framed as tasteful evolution rather than rebellion. The moral landscape did not prohibit creativity, but it demanded justification. Every departure from expectation required explanation, even if that explanation was never spoken. Gardens also encoded judgments about effort. A landscape that appeared too perfect risked suspicion. Excessive precision suggested labor that was either obsessive or inadequately concealed. The ideal garden appeared well-tended but not labored over. Its virtue lay in seeming natural while being carefully maintained. This balance mirrored expectations placed on personal conduct. Effort was expected. Strain was not to be shown. Importantly, morality in the garden was not absolute. It was comparative. One garden was read against another. Standards shifted subtly with location, season, and social context. What was acceptable in one neighborhood might appear ostentatious in another. Moral interpretation adapted to its audience, reinforcing the idea that virtue itself was socially negotiated. The moral dimension of gardens also extended inward. Those who tended them often internalized their discipline. Routine maintenance fostered habits of attention and patience. Order outside reinforced order within. The garden became both expression and reinforcement of moral identity. Its demands shaped behavior as much as they reflected it. Yet beneath this alignment of nature and virtue lay contradiction. The garden presented an idealized morality that ignored its own foundations. Labor was hidden. Inequality was disguised. Control was aestheticized. The calm surface masked the realities required to sustain it. The moral landscape, while convincing, was incomplete. Still, its power endured. To move through a well-kept garden was to feel reassured. The space suggested that chaos could be contained, that beauty could be disciplined, that meaning could be arranged. In a world marked by rapid change and social uncertainty, this quiet promise mattered. Thus, Gilded Age gardens did more than please the eye. They instructed the conscience. They offered a vision of order that felt ethical as well as beautiful. And in doing so, they transformed soil and stone into a landscape of judgment, where virtue was cultivated, displayed, and silently assessed. In the Gilded Age garden, time itself was cultivated. Seasons were not merely endured or admired. They were anticipated, managed, and interpreted. The appearance of certain blooms carried meaning precisely because of when they appeared. Timing transformed flowers into signals. A garden spoke not only through what it displayed, but through when it chose to do so. Spring suggested emergence and possibility, but excess too early invited suspicion. To bloom ahead of one's neighbors risked appearing eager, even aggressive. Restraint was admired. A garden that unfolded gradually suggested patience and confidence. It implied an owner secure enough to wait. Timing became a measure of self-control, and self-control remained a primary social virtue. Summer carried different expectations. Abundance was permitted, even admired, but only within balance. Overcrowding suggested indulgence. Too little color implied neglect or withdrawal. The successful summer garden appeared full without strain, lively without noise. Its timing aligned with social calendars, hosting, visits, and display. Blooms were expected to support social life without overwhelming it. Autumn introduced another register entirely. Decline, if handled well, became dignity. Fading blooms were not removed too quickly, nor allowed to linger in decay. The garden acknowledged change without dramatizing it. This measured response mirrored acceptable emotional conduct. Loss could be recognized, but not indulged. The garden modeled how to let go without spectacle. Winter, often overlooked, carried its own meaning. Bare structures, visible bones of design, revealed the discipline beneath the surface. A garden that retained coherence without flowers demonstrated planning rather than reliance on ornament. Evergreens signaled endurance. Hardscapes affirmed permanence. Even absence was curated. The garden remained legible, even when silent. Seasonal timing also intersected with social awareness. A bloom appearing at the wrong moment could communicate unintended messages. Morning households avoided exuberant color. Celebrations called for subtle emphasis rather than sudden transformation. Gardens were adjusted in response to social events, sometimes weeks in advance. Timing allowed sensitivity without announcement. This sensitivity required constant attention. Gardeners, both visible and unseen, monitored growth with precision. Blooms were encouraged or delayed. Displays were shaped to coincide with visits, dinners, and returns from absence. The garden kept pace with social rhythm, its changes aligning with expectation. Surprise was used sparingly, familiarity reassured. Importantly, seasonal meaning was relational. A flower's significance depended on its contrast with surrounding absence or presence. A single bloom in early spring drew attention precisely because little else had emerged. Late-season color carried weight because it resisted decline. Timing amplified meaning by narrowing context. This temporal awareness reinforced hierarchy. Those fluent in seasonal codes recognized intention. Those unfamiliar might admire without understanding. The garden thus rewarded attentiveness and memory. It required its audience to notice not only what was present, but what had been present before. Meaning unfolded across time, rather than in a single glance. Seasonal timing also allowed discretion. Messages could be sent without permanence. A bloom appeared, conveyed its implication, then passed. Nothing remained to be cited. The garden communicated briefly, then returned to neutrality. This transience protected both sender and recipient. Meaning existed without residue. Through this management of time, the garden extended its language beyond space. It spoke in sequences rather than statements. It relied on anticipation and recollection. To understand it fully, one had to observe repeatedly, to remember what had changed and when. The garden trained its observers in patience. In the Gilded Age, to cultivate a garden was to cultivate timing. Seasons were not passive cycles, but instruments of expression. Through careful alignment with social rhythm, the garden ensured that its messages arrived precisely when they would be felt most deeply, then faded before they could be challenged. The Gilded Age garden rested on a paradox. It was a space of constant expression that appeared utterly quiet. Every choice spoke, yet nothing seemed to be said. This silence was not emptiness, nor absence of meaning. It was cultivated deliberately, rooted as firmly in soil as any flower or hedge. The garden did not demand attention, it waited. Silence was one of the garden's greatest virtues. In a society where speech could compromise, where a misplaced word might circulate far beyond its intention. The garden offered communication without consequence. It allowed thoughts to be displayed without being voiced, judgments to be implied without accusation. This made it invaluable. Silence preserved control. The soil itself became a medium of restraint. What grew there did so within boundaries carefully imposed. Roots were directed. Growth was limited. Excess was pruned before it became visible. The garden thus mirrored the inner discipline expected of those who maintained it. Just as emotion was managed privately, so too was growth regulated beneath the surface. What appeared above ground was only what had been permitted. Visitors experienced this silence physically. Footsteps softened by gravel. Voices lowered unconsciously. The garden encouraged quiet simply by existing. It slowed movement and dampened urgency. Conversation often stalled or thinned, replaced by observation. Silence felt appropriate, even necessary. The space demanded it without instruction. This enforced calm also served a social function. Silence prevented confrontation. It allowed differences to coexist without resolution. Rival households might echo each other's designs without acknowledgement. Personal tensions could be diffused through parallel cultivation. The garden absorbed conflict and released it as aesthetic variation. Nothing had to be addressed directly. Silence also allowed ambiguity to thrive. Meaning was present, but never fixed. A bed left sparse might suggest restraint, mourning, or indifference. An abundance of white might indicate sincerity, absence, or simply preference. Without speech, interpretation remained open. This uncertainty protected all parties. No conclusion could be proven. The endurance of this silence depended on shared discipline. Everyone involved had to agree not to name what they recognized. This collective restraint created stability. It maintained the illusion that gardens were neutral spaces, even as they functioned as instruments of judgment and communication. Silence made the system possible. Importantly, this quiet was not passive. It required constant maintenance. Weeds were removed. Growth was redirected. Gaps were filled deliberately. The garden's silence was actively produced. Without attention, noise would emerge in the form of disorder. Just as social composure required effort, so did botanical restraint. Over time, this cultivated silence shaped perception. Those raised within it learned to value understatement. They became sensitive to nuance, skilled in reading what was not said. The garden trained its audience in a way of seeing that privileged implication over declaration. It rewarded patience and attentiveness. Yet, silence also excluded. Those unfamiliar with its codes might admire without understanding. They could walk the paths and observe the beds, yet miss the layers beneath. The garden did not accommodate explanation. It offered no glossary. Silence protected meaning by limiting access. In the end, the Gilded Age garden achieved its power precisely because it remained quiet. It spoke without sound, instructed without command, and judged without accusation. Its silence was not emptiness, but density, packed with intention. Rooted in soil and sustained by restraint, it stood as one of the era's most effective languages, precisely because it refused to speak aloud. In the Gilded Age, a bouquet delivered without a card was rarely an oversight. It was a decision, carefully weighed and quietly executed. The absence of a written message did not diminish meaning. It intensified it. Without explanation, the flowers were left to speak entirely for themselves, and in doing so, they demanded a reader who understood how to listen. A card fixed intention. It named sender and sentiment. It reduced interpretation to confirmation. A bouquet without one invited interpretation instead. It created a moment of pause in which the recipient was required to consider not only the flowers themselves, but the circumstances of their arrival. Who might have sent them? Why now? What was being implied rather than declared? This ambiguity was the point. A sender who omitted a card retained deniability. Nothing had been stated. No claim had been made. Should the message be welcomed, it could be received as understood. Should it be unwelcome, it could be dismissed as coincidence or courtesy. Silence preserved flexibility, allowing the exchange to remain socially safe. The choice of flowers mattered all the more in this context. Without words, each bloom carried greater weight. Color combinations, freshness, and arrangement were read closely. A restrained selection suggested care and deliberation. An overly elaborate bouquet risked appearing intrusive or presumptuous. Balance signaled respect. Excess invited scrutiny. Timing amplified meaning. A bouquet arriving after a public event might reference something observed but not discussed. One delivered during illness or absence suggested concern without intrusion. Flowers sent at moments of transition carried particular resonance. The lack of a card forced the recipient to consider the moment itself as part of the message. Recipients, in turn, were expected to respond with equal discretion. Acknowledgement was often indirect. Flowers might be displayed prominently or quietly set aside. Their placement within the home communicated reception without requiring words. Others who noticed might infer meaning without it ever being confirmed. The exchange unfolded in layers of observation and restraint. The absence of a card also protected social boundaries. It allowed communication across lines that might otherwise be improper. Admiration could be expressed without exposure. Displeasure could be signaled without accusation. Sympathy could be offered without obligating response. Flowers carried emotion lightly, never forcing reply. This practice depended on shared literacy. Only those familiar with floral language could fully interpret such gestures. To others, the bouquet might appear merely decorative. This selective comprehension reinforced social cohesion among those who understood the code, while preserving politeness for those who did not. Bouquets without cards were particularly effective in environments where scrutiny was constant. In households where servants observed, deliveries and visitors noticed arrangements. Written messages risked circulation. Flowers alone could not be quoted or repeated with certainty. Their meaning remained fluid, protected by interpretation rather than record. Importantly, this practice reinforced the broader culture of implication. Directness was avoided not because feeling was absent, but because it was considered dangerous. To leave something unsaid was to maintain control. The bouquet became a vessel for sentiment that could not safely be articulated. Over time, this silent exchange became normalized. Its effectiveness lay in its invisibility. No rules were written, no acknowledgement required. Flowers arrived, were read, and were absorbed into the social fabric without disturbance. The absence of a card became itself a form of eloquence. In the Gilded Age, to send flowers without a name was not to evade responsibility, but to practice refinement. It demonstrated awareness of limits, respect for ambiguity, and trust in shared understanding. The bouquet spoke softly, and because it did, it was often heard more clearly than any written word. In the Gilded Age garden, color functioned as emotion made visible, yet disciplined by convention. It was not chosen casually. Hue carried implication, and intensity suggested degree. To arrange color was to arrange feeling in a form that could be seen, measured, and contained. Where words might overreach, color offered restraint. White held particular authority. It suggested sincerity, composure, and moral clarity. Used sparingly, it conveyed refinement. Used excessively, it risked coldness or withdrawal. White blooms near entrances implied propriety and welcome without warmth. Deeper within a garden, they suggested introspection. Placement mattered as much as presence, and observers noted both. Red demanded caution. It carried associations of vitality and passion, but also of impropriety if allowed to dominate. A single red bloom could serve as emphasis, drawing the eye and signaling intensity without excess. And abundance invited speculation. In the Gilded Age, intensity was expected to be controlled. Red therefore appeared most often in measured doses, contained within broader palettes. Pastel tones suggested moderation. Soft blues, pale pinks, and gentle yellows implied sociability and ease. They were safe choices, unlikely to provoke commentary. Their emotional register was accessible but restrained. A garden rich in such tones suggested amiability without urgency, friendliness without demand. Dark colors introduced gravity. Deep purples and rich blues hinted at seriousness and depth. They were often reserved for shaded areas or spaces intended for contemplation. Used judiciously, they added complexity. Used carelessly, they risked heaviness. Their presence suggested awareness of emotional nuance, an ability to acknowledge depth without being consumed by it. Color combinations amplified meaning. Harmony suggested balance. Contrast suggested intention. Sudden shifts drew attention, often deliberately. A garden that moved from restraint to vibrancy. Along a path communicated progression, perhaps invitation. One that maintained consistent tone throughout suggested steadiness and control. Observers read these transitions intuitively, rarely articulating their impressions. Seasonal color also mattered. Bright hues appearing too early risked impatience. Lingering color late in the year suggested endurance or resistance to decline. Timing shaped interpretation. A garden that respected seasonal rhythm demonstrated self-awareness. One that disrupted it invited interpretation, favorable or otherwise. Importantly, color was relational. Its meaning depended on surrounding context. A vivid bloom among muted tones carried more weight than the same bloom in abundance. Absence sharpened perception. Restraint intensified impact. The most skilled arrangements used color economically, allowing each presence to register clearly. Color also functioned as a social filter. Those fluent in its codes recognized intention. Those less experienced might respond only to surface beauty. This disparity preserved hierarchy without announcement. Knowledge revealed itself through response, not declaration. Even mistakes carried meaning. A clashing palette suggested haste or insecurity. Over-coordination hinted at rigidity. The garden exposed emotional posture through color choices, whether intended or not. Once planted, these decisions could not easily be revised. Color lingered, subject to scrutiny over time. Yet despite its expressive capacity, color remained deniable. One could always claim preference or chance. Emotional implication remained unspoken. This preserved the garden's central advantage. It communicated feeling without confession. In the Gilded Age, color allowed emotion to exist publicly without violating decorum. It translated feeling into form, intensity into hue, and intention into arrangement. Read correctly, it revealed inner states. Ignored, it remained merely beautiful. This duality made color one of the garden's most powerful and carefully managed languages. In the Gilded Age garden, what was missing often carried more meaning than what was present. Absence functioned as a deliberate element of design, carefully shaped and quietly observed. An unplanted bed, a gap between colors, or the removal of a once familiar bloom spoke with particular force. These silences in the landscape were rarely accidental. They were noticed, interpreted, and remembered. Absence required familiarity to be understood. Only those who had seen a garden before could recognize what no longer stood there. This gave absence a selective audience. It communicated most clearly to those already paying attention. Others might pass without noticing, unaware that anything had changed. The message existed, but only where history was shared. The removal of flowers could suggest many things. It might indicate mourning, a withdrawal from display, or a deliberate refusal to participate in expectation. It could mark disapproval or distance. In some cases, it simply acknowledged limitation. Context guided interpretation. Yet the absence itself always invited speculation. Why had something been taken away? Why now? Empty space sharpened attention. Where abundance soothed the eye, absence unsettled it slightly. The viewer paused, sensing intention even if unsure of its meaning. This pause was powerful. It created room for thought, allowing emotion to surface quietly. Absence made the garden contemplative rather than decorative. In social contexts, absence often served as restraint. During periods of grief or uncertainty, gardens were intentionally simplified. Color was reduced. Variety was limited. These choices signaled withdrawal without explanation. They respected decorum while acknowledging inner change. The garden adjusted so that its owner did not have to speak. Absence also functioned as refusal. Certain blooms carried expectations. Their omission challenged those expectations subtly. A host who declined to plant fashionable varieties signaled independence or disinterest. This gesture was quiet, but it was noticed. Absence allowed dissent without confrontation. Even temporary absence mattered. A bed left unfilled longer than expected invited attention. It suggested deliberation or hesitation. The delay itself became a message. Timing once again shaped meaning. The garden communicated through what it withheld as much as through what it revealed. Importantly, absence protected the sender. Nothing could be accused or proven. The garden had not spoken. It had merely remained silent. Interpretation lay with the observer. This ambiguity preserved social safety while allowing communication to occur. Absence also carried emotional weight. It mirrored loss and longing. A flower no longer present recalled its former place, creating a quiet echo. The garden remembered even when the bloom was gone. This memory lingered, shaping perception over time. The discipline required to use absence effectively was considerable. It demanded restraint and confidence. To leave space unfilled risked appearing incomplete. Only those secure in their position could afford such gestures. Absence thus became a mark of assurance rather than lack. In this way, Gilded Age gardens spoke through omission. They acknowledged that meaning did not require abundance. Silence, space, and restraint could carry sentiment more precisely than any display. Absence invited interpretation, reflection, and memory. It asked the observer to notice not only what was there, but what had been deliberately left behind. In the Gilded Age garden, neglect was never neutral. A wilted bloom left unremoved carried meaning precisely because it violated expectation. Gardens were spaces of vigilance. Their beauty depended on constant attention. To allow a flower to fade in plain view was to permit disorder, and disorder invited interpretation. Wilt, when visible, was rarely forgiven as accident. The distinction between natural decline and tolerated decay was understood instinctively. Flowers faded, as all living things did, but they were expected to be removed at the proper moment. Timing mattered. A bloom left too long suggested indifference or intent. Observers noticed such details, often without conscious effort. The eye lingered. The judgment followed. Wilted flowers communicated withdrawal. They suggested a lapse in care that extended beyond horticulture. Was the household distracted? Was attention deliberately withheld? Was something amiss? The unanswered questions accumulated quietly. A single, neglected bed could unsettle an otherwise orderly landscape, casting doubt on the discipline that sustained it. In social terms, visible neglect could function as quiet insult. A guest arriving to find a familiar arrangement, diminished or deteriorating, might read it as signal. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Something once tended was no longer prioritized. The insult lay in plausibility. No accusation could be made. The garden simply appeared as it did. This ambiguity protected the sender. Wilt could be blamed on weather, chance, or oversight. Yet repetition erased innocence. A pattern of neglect revealed intention. Those attentive enough to notice understood the difference. Others might pass without comment. The message was selective, directed only at those meant to receive it. Wilt also carried emotional undertones. It suggested fatigue, disappointment, or resignation. Unlike absence, which required confidence, visible decline implied strain. It hinted at effort, withdrawn rather than withheld. This made wilt particularly potent. It revealed vulnerability without confession. Importantly, wilted blooms disrupted the garden's promise of control. They introduced impermanence into a space designed to mask it. This disruption was unsettling. It reminded observers that order required maintenance, and that maintenance could fail. In a society invested in appearances, such reminders carried weight. The decision to leave wilt visible was rarely careless. It required tolerating judgment. Only those willing to risk misinterpretation employed it deliberately. As a result, wilted blooms often appeared in contexts already charged with tension. They intensified existing unease rather than creating it anew. Even the placement of wilt mattered. A fading bloom near an entrance drew immediate attention. One hidden among denser plantings might be overlooked. The garden controlled the visibility of neglect, just as it controlled beauty. Wilt could be allowed, quietly, observed by those who knew where to look. For those responsible for maintenance, the presence of wilt demanded discretion. Removing it too quickly erased meaning. Leaving it too long risked excess. The balance required sensitivity and judgment. Gardeners became unwitting participants in social communication, executing decisions whose implications extended beyond the grounds. Over time, observers learned to read wilt as they read color or arrangement. It became part of the garden's vocabulary. Not every instance carried message, but enough did to keep attention sharp. The garden trained its audience to notice decline as carefully as bloom. In the Gilded Age, insult rarely announced itself. It appeared in softened forms, cloaked in politeness. Wilted blooms embodied this approach. They conveyed disapproval without confrontation, distance without declaration. Their power lay in restraint. They did not accuse. They merely remained fading quietly, inviting interpretation and leaving judgment to take root on its own. In the Gilded Age garden, meaning did not reside solely in the choice of flowers, but in where those flowers were allowed to exist. Placement functioned as emphasis, directing attention with quiet authority. A bloom positioned at a threshold carried different weight than the same bloom hidden along a side path. The garden spoke spatially, arranging its language so that certain messages could not be ignored, while others required deliberate noticing. Placement established hierarchy. Flowers closest to the house were read first and most carefully. These beds were understood to represent the household itself, its values, and its intentions. What appeared there was assumed to be deliberate. Carelessness in this space invited scrutiny. Excellence affirmed control. The garden announced itself immediately, and placement determined what that announcement would be. Paths, entrances, and windows framed meaning. A bloom placed where it intersected the natural line of sight gained authority. It became part of the experience rather than a detail. Visitors did not have to seek it out. It asserted itself gently, shaping impression before conscious analysis could intervene. This was emphasis without insistence. Conversely, flowers placed away from primary roots suggested discretion. Their meanings were reserved for those who lingered or returned. Such placement implied intimacy or selectivity. The message was not for everyone. It required time, familiarity, or invitation. This distinction reinforced social boundaries. The garden offered layers of access, each with its own register of meaning. Vertical placement mattered as well. Low plantings suggested humility or restraint. Taller growth near boundaries hinted at protection or separation. height altered relationship. A flower at eye level demanded engagement. One placed below encouraged observation rather than interaction. The garden shaped not only what was seen, but how it was encountered. Placement also interacted with absence. A single bloom isolated within space drew attention through contrast. It became focal, charged by its solitude. Surrounding emptiness sharpened perception. The garden used space as punctuation, allowing emphasis to emerge through restraint rather than abundance. Repetition reinforced message. A flower placed consistently at multiple entrances suggested intention rather than accident. Pattern created coherence. It assured the observer that what was being communicated was not incidental. Placement thus provided continuity across the landscape, linking separate views into a unified statement. Mistakes in placement were revealing. A flower positioned awkwardly suggested haste or uncertainty. Misalignment disrupted the garden's narrative flow. Observers might not articulate their discomfort, but they felt it. The garden relied on intuitive reading. Disruption unsettled that intuition. Placement also mediated emotional tone. A vivid color placed deep within the garden softened its impact. The same color near an entrance intensified it. Emotional weight shifted with proximity. The garden managed feeling by controlling where emotion appeared. It allowed intensity without exposure by situating it carefully. Those responsible for arranging placement exercised quiet power. They decided which messages were public and which remained private. In doing so, they shaped perception without needing to explain or defend their choices. The garden became a controlled environment of emphasis, guiding interpretation while maintaining deniability. Over time, placement trained observers. Regular visitors learned where to look, where meaning tended to gather. They noticed changes quickly. A shift in placement signaled change in intention. The garden thus communicated through adjustment rather than declaration. In the Gilded Age, to place a flower was to make a decision about visibility, importance, and audience. Placement transformed beauty into emphasis. It allowed the garden to speak with precision, directing attention where it mattered most, and letting the rest remain quietly in the background, waiting to be discovered. The Gilded Age garden was designed to be seen, yet never fully known. It occupied a paradoxical position as both public offering and private instrument. What appeared open to all was, in truth, layered with intention, its meanings calibrated to separate audiences without announcing the division. The garden displayed itself generously while reserving its deeper significance for those equipped to recognize it. Public display was unavoidable. Gardens bordered streets, framed entrances, and greeted visitors before conversation could begin. Their visibility made them instruments of first impression. Order reassured. Beauty softened. Familiar forms invited trust. This surface presentation was deliberate, composed to communicate stability and propriety to the broadest audience. It asked little of the viewer beyond appreciation. Yet beneath this public face, the garden held private meanings that did not seek universal comprehension. Certain choices were made with specific individuals in mind. A repeated motif recalled a shared memory. A restrained palette acknowledged a quiet understanding. A subtle alteration marked distance or renewed favor. These messages were not meant for the crowd. They were directed, precise, and easily overlooked by those not intended to receive them. This dual function relied on discretion. The public layer could never appear incomplete or puzzling. It had to satisfy general expectation. The private layer had to remain legible without disrupting the whole. The most effective gardens managed this balance so seamlessly that observers sensed coherence without suspecting complexity. Meaning traveled beneath beauty, not alongside it. The distinction between public and private was often spatial. Prominent beds communicated conformity and welcome. Deeper areas carried nuance. A garden might appear conventional at a glance, then reveal deviation upon closer inspection. This progression mirrored social interaction. Casual acquaintances received the surface. Trusted visitors encountered the subtext. Timing reinforced this division. Public displays changed slowly, respecting season and custom. Private meanings shifted more quickly, responding to personal events or evolving relationships. A bloom introduced briefly, then removed, could carry significance for one person, while leaving no lasting trace for others. The garden allowed communication that was both ephemeral and targeted. This system protected participants. Public decorum remained intact. Private sentiment found expression without exposure. If a message was missed, nothing was lost. If it was received, acknowledgement could remain unspoken. The garden facilitated exchange without obligating response. Such discretion required skill. Too obvious a gesture risked speculation. Too obscure a signal risked being lost. The gardener, whether owner or proxy, learned to calibrate subtlety. Precision mattered. A slight shift in placement or color could alter interpretation entirely. The garden demanded attentiveness from both sender and receiver. Public display also provided cover. A private message could hide within an acceptable arrangement, indistinguishable from decoration to most eyes. This camouflage was essential in a society wary of overt expression. It allowed intimacy to exist within propriety. The garden offered sanctuary for meaning that could not safely surface elsewhere. Over time, frequent visitors learned to read between layers. They noticed what changed and what remained constant. They sensed when the public face concealed a private adjustment. This awareness created quiet bonds, formed not through confession, but through recognition. The garden fostered connection without demanding acknowledgement. Yet the separation between public and private was never absolute. Occasionally, meanings leaked. An observant outsider might glimpse intention not meant for them. Such moments carried risk. They reminded all involved that discretion depended on shared restraint. The garden required complicity to function as intended. In the Gilded Age, to display publicly while speaking privately was a valued skill. Gardens perfected this art. They maintained openness without surrendering intimacy. They allowed meaning to circulate selectively, preserving decorum while enabling expression. In doing so, they became spaces where society could see itself reflected without ever being fully revealed. In the Gilded Age, repetition altered meaning. A gesture offered once might be received as kindness or courtesy. The same gesture repeated too frequently invited scrutiny. Flowers, when sent often, lost their innocence. What began as attention could quietly become pressure. The garden, attuned to nuance, reflected this shift with uncomfortable clarity. A single bouquet suggested thoughtfulness. Regular deliveries suggested intention. Excessive frequency suggested insistence. The line between consideration and intrusion was thin, and once crossed, difficult to retreat from without embarrassment. Flowers, by their nature, lingered briefly. Their recurrence amplified their presence beyond their lifespan. Each new arrival recalled the last, accumulating significance rather than replacing it. Recipients were acutely aware of this accumulation. They counted without appearing to count. They noted intervals. Too predictable a pattern suggested expectation. Too rapid a return suggested impatience. The absence of written explanation intensified this awareness. Without words, timing became the message. Frequency spoke louder than color or arrangement ever could. For the sender, repetition offered risk and reward. Persistent gifting could signal devotion or loyalty. It could also reveal insecurity or urgency. The interpretation depended on context, relationship, and restraint. Skilled senders varied their gestures. They allowed space between offerings. They let silence intervene. Absence restored balance. Repetition without pause eroded subtlety. Gardens responded to these patterns as well. A household receiving frequent flowers might adjust displays to manage perception. Some arrangements were integrated visibly. Others were set aside discreetly. Placement communicated reception without reply. A prominently displayed bouquet suggested welcome. A modest placement suggested acknowledgement without encouragement. The garden absorbed the burden of response. Observers noticed these patterns. Frequent floral presence drew attention. It raised questions that were rarely voiced, but widely considered. Who was sending? Why so often? Was the attention wanted? The garden became a stage where repetition played out in view of those trained to observe quietly. Excess also disrupted decorum. Gilded Age culture prized moderation. Too much attention, even when beautifully delivered, risked appearing improper. Flowers that arrived too often threatened the balance between expression and restraint. They forced interpretation. They demanded response, even if that response remained unspoken. Recipients navigated this tension carefully. They did not reject flowers openly. That would have been ungracious. Instead, they managed visibility. They adjusted placement. They allowed some arrangements to fade quietly. These choices communicated boundaries subtly, preserving politeness while restoring distance. Repetition also exposed imbalance. One-sided gifting suggested unequal investment. The garden revealed this asymmetry through accumulation. What was once flattering became conspicuous. The silence surrounding it grew heavier. The garden, once a space of ease, acquired tension. Importantly, gifts sent too often could not easily be corrected. To stop abruptly invited speculation. To continue risked excess. The sender faced the dilemma of recalibration without acknowledgement. The recipient bore the weight of interpretation without reply. The garden mediated this stalemate, offering gradual adjustment rather than decisive change. Over time, repetition taught caution. It reinforced the value of spacing and restraint. The most effective gestures were those that appeared unplanned, even when carefully timed. The garden favored moderation. It rewarded those who understood that meaning thrived not in abundance, but in measured presence. In the Gilded Age, flowers were powerful precisely because they were fleeting. To repeat them too often was to misunderstand their strength. The garden recorded this lesson quietly, reminding all who observed that attention, like beauty, required balance to remain welcome. In the Gilded Age, gardens did more than celebrate life. They marked absence and loss. Mourning shaped the landscape as much as beauty or display. Flowers became instruments of reflection, empathy, and restraint, communicating grief without words. The arrangement of blooms during times of sorrow was as deliberate and codified as any social ritual, each choice conveying respect, restraint, and understanding. White dominated the palette. Its purity suggested solemnity and sympathy. A garden filled with pale blooms expressed calm, reverence, and contemplation. It invited visitors to move gently, to observe quietly, and to absorb emotion without intrusion. Color was carefully muted, as a single vibrant bloom could disturb the carefully calibrated mood, creating unintended messages or drawing attention away from the intended focus. Arrangement mattered as much as selection. Flowers were grouped thoughtfully, avoiding overcrowding or excessive flourish. Even in mourning, excess risked appearing performative or inappropriate. Minimalism conveyed sincerity. Deliberate spacing allowed each bloom to communicate individually and collectively, emphasizing significance without theatricality. The garden spoke quietly, allowing emotion to surface subtly without dominating the senses. Timing held particular weight. Certain flowers were associated with particular phases of grief or remembrance. Early blooms, emerging in spring, could suggest renewal and hope. Late blooms, lingering through summer into autumn, marked enduring remembrance. The gardener calibrated the arrival of each flower, to reflect not only the season, but the household's emotional rhythm. Meaning resided not just in color or species, but in the moment of appearance. Morning gardens also relied on absence. Spaces deliberately left unplanted, or areas cleared of previous blooms, communicated loss. The viewer understood what should have been present. Empty soil spoke of grief and pause, acknowledging absence as profoundly as presence. This silent punctuation created a dialogue between what was visible and what was missing, making observation an act of reflection. Recovery, in contrast, introduced measured vitality. Subtle touches of color signaled emerging life, signaling that grief was acknowledged yet balanced with acceptance. The transition from muted tones to gentle pastels guided perception, allowing the household to move gradually from sorrow to composure. The pace of recovery was controlled, each adjustment reinforcing decorum and patience. The audience of these gardens was expected to interpret with sensitivity. Guests understood that deviations from expected patterns could convey emotion or social cues. A flower removed too quickly might suggest haste or indifference. A bloom left to linger might express respect, restraint, or continued mourning. These subtleties created a conversation without words, reinforcing bonds among those attentive enough to notice. Labor behind the scenes remained invisible. Servants and gardeners maintained order meticulously, ensuring that displays appeared effortless. Their work preserved the silence of emotion, allowing the garden to convey sentiment without interruption or disclosure. Without this diligence, meaning could be obscured or distorted. Morning gardens also taught restraint. They reminded observers that expression could be public without being ostentatious. They modeled patience, subtlety, and attentiveness, shaping behavior alongside perception. The landscape became a tutor, offering lessons in propriety while mediating the intensity of grief. In the Gilded Age, gardens transformed private emotion into visible language. Mourning and recovery were communicated not through speech, but through careful arrangement, color, absence, and timing. The garden became a stage where sorrow could be honored with dignity, where recovery could emerge without haste, and where all expression remained carefully moderated, observed, and understood. In the Gilded Age, the introduction of exotic plants carried a weight beyond novelty. Imported species were prized not merely for their beauty, but for the subtle messages they conveyed. Their presence suggested sophistication, discernment, and access to networks far beyond the immediate household. To cultivate a rare bloom was to signal cultural fluency, to participate in a quiet dialogue that was understood only by those versed in the unspoken language of status and taste. These plants required care that native species did not. Their fragility or unusual requirements demonstrated diligence and expertise. A garden flourishing with such specimens suggested mastery and patience. Neglect, however, was more conspicuous than with common flora. Failure indicated inattention or misjudgment, and observers interpreted this as reflective of character rather than horticultural skill. Excellence and understanding were inseparable in the cultivation of the exotic. Exotic plants also functioned as instruments of silent provocation. Their very presence could unsettle visitors who recognized both the beauty and the challenge. Those uninitiated in their care might admire superficially, unaware of the skill required. Those knowledgeable perceived the display as a declaration of subtle superiority. The garden thus communicated hierarchy without confrontation, rewarding familiarity while preserving ambiguity. Placement amplified meaning. Exotic specimens were often positioned to catch the eye at key moments, near entrances, along prominent paths, or in secluded corners visible only to careful observers. Their visibility was controlled to achieve maximum effect without ostentation. A single rare bloom could speak more convincingly than a multitude of common flowers, provided it was shown thoughtfully and deliberately. Seasonality was equally important. The arrival of an exotic bloom at the proper moment signaled precision. It suggested that the household was attuned to both nature and social expectation, able to orchestrate beauty according to plan. Early or late appearance risked misinterpretation, implying impatience, mismanagement, or disregard for tradition. Timing, as always, transformed display into message. Exotic plants could also challenge norms. They implied a willingness to step beyond convention, to assert individuality within the constraints of propriety. A bold introduction into a traditional garden suggested confidence and daring. Conversely, excessive use of novelty risked appearing flamboyant or tasteless. The garden walked a fine line, rewarding discernment and punishing misjudgment. For visitors, exotic plants invited closer observation. Their unfamiliar forms and colors demanded attention, curiosity, and contemplation. Those who could appreciate the nuance were recognized as competent and perceptive. Those who failed to notice or misread the meaning were quietly distinguished from the initiated. The garden thus functioned as both educator and evaluator. Labor remained hidden but essential. Greenhouses, careful watering, and attentive pruning ensured that exotic species survived and thrived. This invisible effort reinforced the notion that appearance and skill were inseparable. The garden's beauty was inseparable from the care invested, and the careful observer understood the effort underlying the display. Exotic plants also carried connotations of travel, wealth, and connections. Their presence suggested access to distant lands, to agents and merchants who could procure the rare. To maintain them successfully indicated not only diligence, but the resources necessary to do so. Social capital was encoded in soil and foliage. In the Gilded Age, exotic plants became a language of subtle provocation and quiet authority. They rewarded knowledge, commanded attention, and asserted refinement without words. Their cultivation transformed the garden into a space where beauty, ambition, and social skill were intertwined, leaving an impression on those who saw, understood, and recognized the deliberate power of careful selection. In the Gilded Age garden, understanding was a quiet triumph. The language of flowers, color, placement, and absence only reached its full potency when it was correctly received. A glance at a carefully arranged bed could communicate intention as clearly as any note or whispered remark, provided the observer possessed the knowledge to interpret it. Recognition was a shared secret, unspoken yet palpable, binding sender and recipient in subtle comprehension. This understanding was rarely instantaneous. It depended on attentiveness and memory. Observers learned to notice patterns over time, recalling prior arrangements, previous blooms, and subtle alterations. Familiarity allowed them to detect nuance, to read intent that could be lost on a casual passerby. The garden rewarded persistence and observation, offering layers of meaning that unfolded gradually, like a conversation conducted in silence. Once recognized, the message shaped behavior. A visitor aware of a bloom's intended implication adjusted posture, expression, and attention accordingly. Approval could be indicated through lingering, subtle gestures or quiet commentary. Displeasure could be registered in the avoidance of a space, in the neglect of a visual cue, or in the absence of expected engagement. The garden allowed reaction without requiring declaration, preserving discretion while facilitating acknowledgement. This shared understanding extended to relationships. Courtesies and rivalries were negotiated through floral cues, visible only to those who knew how to read them. A carefully placed bloom could signal favor, concern, or reproach. Its interpretation depended entirely on prior knowledge, social context, and familiarity with custom. The garden acted as mediator, enabling communication where direct speech would have been improper, intrusive, or indiscreet. The elegance of this system lay in its deniability, Even when a message was fully understood, neither party needed to admit comprehension publicly. The sender maintained plausible innocence. The recipient preserved propriety. Observation alone sufficed to acknowledge intent. Social equilibrium was preserved, reinforced by unspoken agreement, and the garden functioned as arbiter of subtle exchange. Understanding also reinforced hierarchy. Those fluent in the language of flowers distinguished themselves from those who were not. Their ability to read meaning without instruction or explanation marked refinement, education, and social competence. Conversely, those unfamiliar with the code were left to admire beauty superficially, their judgment never questioned, yet their perception incomplete. Knowledge became both privilege and responsibility. Accuracy mattered as much as perception. Misreading a display could carry consequences. An arrangement intended to convey distance could be mistaken for favor. Absence, meant as restraint, could be interpreted as neglect. The delicate balance of intention and reception required attentiveness. The garden demanded mindfulness from both sender and observer, cultivating sophistication and subtlety in parallel. Recognition also deepened emotional resonance. Knowing that one had perceived a message as intended created a sense of intimacy without exposure. Approval, caution, or acknowledgement could be conveyed silently, leaving public interaction unaffected. The garden thus facilitated nuanced exchange in a social world where words were often restrained or monitored. Finally, when a message was understood, it became part of ongoing dialogue. Observers remembered prior arrangements, noted new variations, and continued the unspoken exchange across visits and seasons. The garden accumulated meaning over time, layering past communication with present intention and preserving social memory within its soil, paths, and blooms. In the Gilded Age, understanding was the culmination of careful observation, patience, and social literacy. When the message embedded in a garden was recognized, the exchange was complete. Silence confirmed comprehension. Meaning had traveled without sound. Judgment had been exercised without confrontation. And the garden had performed its quietest, most powerful function. It had been read. In the Gilded Age garden, women assumed a role that extended far beyond mere decoration. They were the custodians of meaning, responsible for translating social expectation, emotional nuance, and aesthetic principle into tangible arrangement. Each choice they made, whether in selecting a bloom, arranging a bed, or maintaining a pathway, carried significance. Their labor was invisible, yet it shaped perception, governed interaction, and regulated decorum. This responsibility was both privilege and burden. Women exercised authority within the domestic sphere, directing servants, managing time, and orchestrating display. They dictated which flowers flourished and which faded, who could approach closely, and how each path guided the eye. Their decisions communicated judgment, taste, and intention with precision. Visitors read these signs as fluently as any spoken instruction, though the language remained silent and unspoken. The garden became a stage where women performed discretion, restraint, and subtlety. They balanced beauty with control, ensuring that arrangements reflected order without seeming forced. Color, placement, timing, and absence were calibrated to convey sentiment while maintaining propriety. A misstep could undermine authority or invite misinterpretation. Mastery required attentiveness, foresight, and an understanding of social codes that extended beyond horticulture. Women also mediated communication through plants. Flowers conveyed emotion, signaled favor or disapproval, and negotiated social boundaries without the need for confrontation. A single bloom placed in a visible bed might offer encouragement or admonition. A deliberately empty space suggested withdrawal, restraint, or distance. Each arrangement was a statement, its meaning legible only to those familiar with the garden's language. Their role extended to managing the audience. Women guided visitors along paths, subtly directing attention to blooms meant to be observed and away from those intended for select eyes. Seating, vantage points, and focal points were arranged so that messages were received accurately. Control over perception was as essential as control over growth. The garden was simultaneously a performance and a lesson in social literacy. Training and apprenticeship were implicit. Young women observed elder relatives tending beds, arranging bouquets, and adjusting displays with care. They learned to interpret subtle cues, understand the implications of timing and placement, and anticipate the reactions of those who would encounter their work. Knowledge passed quietly, reinforced through repetition and careful observation. The ability to manage a garden signified both competence and refinement. Even laborers, gardeners, and household staff acted under the direction of women, executing precise instructions that ensured the garden's language was maintained. Their hands extended the authority of the mistress of the house, translating vision into reality. Yet their work remained largely invisible, leaving the household to appear effortless in control. Women's mastery lay in oversight and judgment, rather than mere toil. Beyond aesthetic or domestic considerations, the garden became a locus of social power. Women regulated reputation, conveyed sentiment, and negotiated subtle influence, all through the medium of plant and soil. Their decisions were read by peers, servants, and visitors alike. Through careful cultivation, they exercised authority in ways that words could not achieve, shaping perception without confrontation. In the Gilded Age, gardens were more than decoration, and women were more than caretakers. They were arbiters of meaning, interpreters of tradition, and conductors of silent communication. Every bed, every bloom, every carefully considered absence was their instrument. In their hands, the garden became a language, and understanding that language was as much a testament to their skill as it was to the discipline of those who observed it. In the Gilded Age, the garden was more than a display of beauty. It was domestic territory, an extension of the household that communicated authority and boundaries without words. Every path, bed, and planting was arranged to signify control, to delineate what belonged to the household and what was accessible to visitors. The space spoke silently but unequivocally about ownership, taste, and discipline. The delineation of space was deliberate. Front gardens projected welcome and propriety. Visitors saw order and care, an invitation tempered by refinement. Interiors glimpsed from the garden hinted at domestic arrangement without revealing intimacy. Deeper or more secluded areas were reserved for private contemplation or trusted company. These zones of restricted access allowed the household to maintain control over perception, regulating who could encounter subtle meanings and who would not. Paths defined movement and influence. Gravel, stone, and borders directed footsteps, guiding visitors past displays intended for admiration and away from private or emotionally charged areas. A seemingly casual stroll became a choreographed journey. Visitors learned the unspoken rules quickly, moving in accordance with invisible boundaries. Knowledge of these rules marked the difference between belonging and mere observation. Beds themselves were territorial markers. A carefully tended border suggested authority over both flora and space. Each plant was positioned to reinforce control, asserting hierarchy without confrontation. Intrusion, even unintentional, disrupted the balance. The garden's authority depended on adherence to spatial conventions. The visitor's awareness, or lack thereof, could affirm or challenge the household's command. The maintenance of the garden reflected the discipline of the household. Regular pruning, deadheading, and careful attention to seasonal transition demonstrated continuous oversight. Neglect in any area implied laxity or diminished authority. The household's reputation rested on the state of its garden. By sustaining order in the landscape, the family reinforced its domestic sovereignty, signaling competence, refinement, and reliability. This domestic authority extended to subtle social control. Through the arrangement of blooms and pathways, the household influenced interactions. Certain areas encouraged conversation, observation, or pause. Others discouraged loitering or unwelcome familiarity. Guests who understood these cues navigated appropriately. Those who did not risk subtle rebuke received not in words but in disapproving glance, limited access, or adjusted emphasis in floral display. Territorial signaling was also temporal. Seasonal arrangements reinforced hierarchy. Early blooms near public entrances announced readiness and attention. Late flowers in private corners acknowledged discretion and contemplation. Timing ensured that the household communicated authority consistently, maintaining both presence and privacy throughout the year. Laborers, gardeners, and household staff reinforced territoriality through execution of these designs. Their work translated intention into visible order, yet remained largely invisible to observers. Authority was expressed without evidence of exertion, preserving the impression of effortless command. The garden's coherence depended on this balance between visible effect and hidden labor. Visitors learned quickly that territory in the garden was not accidental. Observation, patience, and restraint were required to navigate the space successfully. Those who failed to respect its signals revealed their inexperience. Those who succeeded were affirmed, their presence validated. The garden, in effect, educated its audience in the norms of propriety while reinforcing the household's domestic claim. In the Gilded Age, gardens functioned as controlled landscapes of authority. They were both invitation and boundary, beauty and governance. Every decision in planting, placement, and pathway reinforced domestic territory. To enter, to move, and to observe correctly was to recognize the household's power without needing a single word. The garden's language was subtle, pervasive, and absolute in its assertion of domestic sovereignty. In the Gilded Age garden, authority was expressed without sound, and the hostess reigned over this domain with quiet command. She directed labor, arranged displays, and orchestrated the movement of visitors, all while appearing to act with grace and ease. Her presence was felt not through voice, but through the deliberate shape of the landscape, the placement of blooms, and the guidance of paths. Each decision she made communicated judgment, taste, and intention to all who observed. The hostess exercised control over the timing of displays. Flowers were positioned to bloom at precise moments, aligned with social events, visits, or seasonal expectation. A bed might be left deliberately bare until the appropriate occasion, creating anticipation and signaling attention to detail. The garden thus reflected her planning and foresight, a visible testament to her influence. Paths and vantage points were managed with equal precision. Visitors were guided subtly to areas meant for admiration, while more private or emotionally nuanced spaces remained partially concealed. The choice of where a guest might pause, linger, or turn their gaze was part of her authority. She choreographed perception so that the garden conveyed messages without a single word. Knowledgeable observers recognized her hand in every curve, every symmetry, and every careful absence. Her control extended to labor. Gardeners and domestic staff executed tasks according to her discretion. Every pruning, deadheading, and seasonal adjustment was performed under her guidance. The hostess ensured that the garden reflected skill, refinement, and careful intention, while the effort behind the display remained largely invisible. In this way, she maintained the illusion of effortless command, a quality as admired as it was necessary. Flowers themselves were instruments of her authority. Their selection, color, and arrangement allowed subtle communication. A single bloom in a prominent position might indicate approval, affection, or emphasis. Groups of muted colors conveyed restraint or respect. Absence and timing reinforced messages of distance, caution, or social boundary. She controlled the social narrative without speaking, using the garden as a silent medium for influence. Guests quickly learned to recognize this authority. Those attentive to cues understood how to navigate the space, how to interpret meaning, and how to respond with appropriate subtlety. The hostess's expectations were conveyed indirectly, yet observed meticulously. Those unfamiliar with the conventions might admire beauty without perceiving the underlying messages. Fluency in the garden's language became a measure of refinement, training, and discretion. The hostess also used her authority to manage social dynamics. Arrangements could mediate tension, highlight alliances, or suggest preference without confrontation. The presence or absence of particular blooms, the emphasis on specific paths, and the timing of displays allowed her to negotiate relationships gracefully. Visitors sensed the subtleties without needing explanation, leaving communication intact while avoiding overt disruption. Seasonality reinforced her role. The garden's shifts across the year reflected her planning and adaptability. Early spring blooms suggested readiness. Summer colors suggested generosity and vitality. Autumn arrangements conveyed reflection and thoughtfulness. Winter, with its carefully structured absence, demonstrated foresight and control. Each change emphasized her judgment and oversight. The hostess's authority also extended to memory. Observers remembered previous arrangements, noting evolution or consistency in the garden's expression. Her intent became evident through repeated patterns, deliberate shifts, and attention to detail. The garden created a lasting impression, a record of her taste, discernment, and subtle influence. In the Gilded Age, the garden was a stage, and the hostess performed without words. Her authority was encoded in placement, color, timing, and restraint. Every visitor, whether aware or untrained, felt the effect of her control. Through careful orchestration, she directed attention, shaped perception, and communicated meaning, establishing dominion that required no declaration, only observation and understanding. In the Gilded Age garden, courtship unfolded with subtlety and discipline. Words were often insufficient, and too direct a declaration risked social censure. The garden offered an alternative medium where intention, attention, and sentiment could be communicated through arrangement, placement, and presence rather than sound. Paths, blooms, and patterns became instruments of expression, allowing participants to converse without uttering a word. Movement through the garden was the first signal. A suitor's choice of path, the direction of his gaze, and the pace of his steps conveyed awareness and interest. Pausing near a particular bed suggested reflection or admiration. Circling a favored bloom invited observation without intrusion. Each decision was intentional, observed and interpreted within the strictures of decorum. Social training enabled participants to recognize these gestures, transforming simple motion into nuanced dialogue. Flowers themselves carried coded meaning. Certain species were associated with affection, others with respect, and still others with desire or caution. A single bloom presented at a calculated angle could signal interest, while the deliberate absence of a familiar flower might communicate restraint or hesitation. Color amplified meaning. Soft tones suggested modesty or admiration. Vibrant hues implied enthusiasm or passion. The careful combination of placement, species, and color allowed messages to circulate invisibly, accessible only to those fluent in the language. Timing heightened the effect. Flowers introduced at precise moments created opportunities for shared attention. A bloom that had just opened invited observation at the height of its beauty. Seasonal alignment reinforced social cues, ensuring that gestures appeared natural rather than contrived. Observers internalized these cues, learning when to respond and when to wait. creating a rhythm of engagement dictated by both the garden and convention. Proximity and visibility were equally important. Certain spaces were designed to allow private interaction without exposure. Hidden benches, secluded nooks, or secondary paths offered moments of observation that remained imperceptible to casual visitors. The suitor and the object of attention could acknowledge one another through gesture or glance without compromising propriety. In these carefully curated spaces, intimacy was permitted without speech. The garden also mediated social hierarchy. Recognizing and respecting unspoken signals demonstrated refinement. Misreading cues could suggest naivete or impropriety. Fluency in the garden's language became a measure of sophistication. The ability to respond appropriately without commentary signaled both understanding and discretion. Laborers and gardeners maintained this language without ever revealing it. Their work ensured that blooms appeared at the right place and time, that paths remained accessible, and that arrangements communicated meaning accurately. The precision of care allowed courtship to unfold smoothly, preserving the illusion of spontaneity while supporting intricate social choreography. Courtship in the garden required restraint. Overzealous attention could draw scrutiny. Too visible and admiration risked embarrassment. The most skilled participants exercised patience, allowing the space, the blooms, and the timing to guide recognition and response. Desire and interest were communicated delicately, reinforced by observation rather than speech. In this environment, subtlety was power. The garden allowed courtship to exist within the bounds of propriety while expressing emotion beyond words. Each step, each glance, each arrangement became a statement. When correctly perceived, meaning was clear, yet unspoken. The Gilded Age garden transformed observation into communication, enabling desire, caution, and consent to coexist quietly, elegantly, and safely within its cultivated boundaries. In the Gilded Age, refusal was an art. Direct denial was seldom acceptable, and even polite words risked misunderstanding. The garden offered a medium through which rejection could be communicated subtly, preserving dignity for both sender and recipient. Placement, absence, and arrangement became instruments of quiet refusal, allowing sentiment to be conveyed without confrontation. The absence of a bloom often spoke more convincingly than its presence. A flower once associated with favor or attention, deliberately omitted, signaled distance. Its omission was not accidental. It was carefully timed to coincide with circumstance, social expectation, or prior correspondence. Those familiar with the language perceived the message immediately, understanding that restraint could express judgment as forcefully as declaration. Placement was equally potent. A bloom relegated to the periphery of a path or partially obscured by taller growth suggested disinterest or reservation. Conversely, central prominence connoted welcome or approval. The hostess, with precise awareness of sightlines and attention, could communicate refusal without ever speaking. The arrangement permitted the intended message to be observed by the discerning, yet remain invisible to the casual visitor. Color and composition reinforced meaning. Muted tones, restrained combinations, or overly subdued arrangements indicated caution or the withdrawal of favor. Vibrancy could be deliberately withheld to signal reserve, while contrast might be minimized to avoid inviting misinterpretation. Every choice of shade, proportion, and placement reflected intention, converting visual experience into nuanced social commentary. Timing heightened the subtlety. Seasonal transitions, delayed bloom, or selective pruning allowed rejection to be expressed in rhythm with the household's activities. A message arrived silently and without announcement, communicated at the precise moment when attention was focused. Observation became a participatory act, requiring perception, patience, and memory. The garden demanded sophistication from those who sought to interpret it. Even gestures of partial attention, could signal restraint, allowing a guest to linger near one bed while diverting their gaze from another created layered meaning. These distinctions were deliberate, calibrated to guide understanding without provocation. Every pathway, bench, and border became part of the choreography of refusal, shaping the visitor's experience while preserving social equilibrium. Laborers and gardeners acted as silent intermediaries. Their meticulous maintenance ensured that the intended signals remained clear and unambiguous. Pruning, deadheading, and selective watering were executed under the hostess's direction to sustain the appearance of controlled beauty. The message was encoded in the living landscape, transmitted through the interplay of observation, attention, and subtle manipulation. The effect was profound. Recipients, if attentive, recognized the withdrawal without embarrassment or public censure. The garden allowed rejection to be delivered gracefully, offering a measure of protection for both parties. Understanding depended upon knowledge of the garden's language and shared conventions. Those attuned to the signals could respond appropriately, preserving civility while internalizing the message. Repetition reinforced recognition. A continued pattern of subtle absence or subdued arrangement emphasized meaning without escalation. Gradual adjustment allowed the message to be absorbed with propriety, ensuring that intention was understood without confrontation. The garden's temporal rhythm transformed refusal into a measured, ongoing conversation. In the Gilded Age, rejection need not be spoken to be effective. The garden provided a framework in which distance could be asserted gracefully, attention could be managed with precision, and social boundaries could be maintained invisibly. Every omission, every peripheral placement, and every muted shade performed the delicate task of refusal. In this cultivated silence, intention was conveyed with elegance, restraint, and enduring subtlety. In the Gilded Age, gardens were not merely spaces of beauty. They were stages upon which rivalry unfolded with discretion. Competitors, social peers, and those seeking influence could find their tensions encoded in soil and bloom. The careful placement of flowers allowed conflict to be expressed without words, transforming the landscape into a silent arena of subtle contest and measured observation. Beds were often designed to highlight comparison. Two species of similar stature or hue might be positioned near each other, inviting juxtaposition. Observers, aware of prior choices or previous displays, perceived differences and drew conclusions. One household could assert refinement or taste through careful alignment, while another might risk perceived inferiority through slight misjudgment. The garden mediated these contests with quiet efficacy. Color and arrangement became instruments of subtle competition. Contrasting shades or repeated motifs signaled intention, while restraint suggested control and confidence. Overabundance risked impression of insecurity or desperation. A rival's miscalculation, visible in timing or composition, offered insight into character and discipline. To read these signals required attentiveness, memory, and understanding of social norms. Paths and vantage points reinforced rivalry. Prominent placement of blooms created deliberate sightlines, allowing comparison to occur naturally. Guests or neighbors walking along these routes encountered both displays in turn, their attention guided by design. The garden choreographed perception so that one display could be assessed against another while maintaining the appearance of natural beauty. Seasons added further complexity. A flower arriving slightly earlier or later than expected might imply foresight or lack thereof. Persistent bloom at the right moment suggested consistency and control, while misalignment risked social commentary. Timing, like color and placement, was weaponized, subtly, amplifying competitive effect without overt statement. Labor reinforced the stakes. The household overseeing the garden ensured that each element performed as intended. Pruning, deadheading, and meticulous maintenance sustained the display. Failure to attend to detail risked exposure, while precision confirmed authority. The skillful gardener became a silent ally, translating intention into visible, persistent effect. Observation was the final arbiter. Those fluent in the garden's language discerned nuance, appreciating skill or noting deficiency. The act of perception itself became part of rivalry, for recognition conferred status and comprehension, while ignorance suggested inexperience. The garden rewarded those attuned, allowing them to participate in social comparison without explicit declaration. Rivalry was encoded not only in what was present, but in what was withheld. Omission of expected blooms, selective pruning, or the deliberate positioning of one species ahead of another could signal subtle critique or competition. These choices required discipline and awareness, for their effects relied upon interpretation rather than proclamation. Even shared spaces allowed for controlled tension. A pathway might lead through multiple displays, presenting side-by-side examples for consideration. The garden created a tableau in which each household's taste, diligence, and subtle authority were measured against others. Comparisons occurred naturally, silently, and without confrontation. In this environment, the garden became a theater of skill, discretion, and judgment. Rivalry was ever present but contained, expressed through design rather than speech. Competitors communicated intention, assessed one another, and demonstrated refinement, all within the cultivated restraint of soil and bloom. In the Gilded Age, flowers planted side by side were more than decoration. They were instruments of subtle power, negotiation, and the quiet assertion of superiority. In the Gilded Age, the garden functioned not merely as a display of taste, but as a shield for reputation. Within its carefully arranged beds, paths, and borders, households could project an image of refinement, discipline, and propriety that reinforced social standing. Its effectiveness depended upon precision, discretion, and consistency. To maintain reputation through the garden required attention both to detail and to perception. The condition of the grounds communicated character. A well-tended bed suggested diligence, foresight, and competence. A hedge clipped evenly signaled patience and control. A pathway swept clean of debris implied orderliness and conscientiousness. These elements offered evidence of virtue in the absence of observation or interaction. The garden presented the household as capable, restrained, and deserving of regard. Strategic display allowed for selective revelation. Prominent flowers near entrances showcased beauty, while more intricate arrangements in private corners rewarded familiarity and subtlety. Guests and neighbors perceived care without intrusion, confirming social standing without requiring commentary. The household's judgment and refinement were evident to those who noticed, yet the mechanisms of that impression remained invisible. Timing reinforced the protective function of the garden. Seasonal blooms and carefully staged transitions signaled attentiveness. Early displays demonstrated preparation and awareness. Later arrangements suggested patience and continuity. By aligning floral cycles with social rhythm, the household conveyed an image of consistent authority. Reputation was maintained not only through appearance, but through demonstration of care over time. The selection and arrangement of plants further contributed to the shield. Exotic or rare species implied knowledge, sophistication, and access to networks beyond the immediate household. Native or common varieties were arranged to emphasize discipline rather than abundance. Color, placement, and proportion were manipulated to project composure. Missteps could undermine credibility, while successful execution strengthened perception. Absence also played a crucial role. Beds left deliberately unplanted, or blooms withheld in accordance with social expectation, conveyed restraint. The garden suggested discretion, teaching observers that the household exercised judgment in both presence and omission. This careful restraint reinforced an image of measured authority, showing control over both emotion and environment. Laborers and household staff ensured that the garden maintained its protective function. Their efforts preserved the appearance of effortless elegance. Pruning, watering, and maintenance were performed in ways that reinforced order without exposing exertion. The household benefited from visible authority while concealing the work necessary to sustain it. Guests internalized the garden's messages through observation. To walk along a well-ordered path and note the precise placement of blooms was to recognize the household's competence without requiring instruction. Social understanding became implicit. Recognition of the household's diligence reinforced bonds and confirmed the legitimacy of its standing. The reputation shield was cumulative. A single well-executed display could impress, but repeated attention to detail and consistent refinement over time established trust and reliability. The garden functioned as a continuous, silent testimony to household virtue, one that could be read and appreciated without words or explanation. In the Gilded Age, gardens protected as much as they adorned. They offered a visible record of care, discipline, and refinement. Every bloom, every hedge, and every path reinforced social position. Observers could assess character without intrusion, and households could project authority and composure effortlessly. Within soil and flower, the garden became both safeguard and statement, preserving reputation while masking effort with beauty. In the Gilded Age, even the most disciplined garden could speak too forcefully. When flowers became too loud, they risked undermining the very propriety they were meant to convey. Excessive color, overwhelming abundance, or attention drawn to unusual placement could transform beauty into spectacle. The careful equilibrium that sustained meaning was fragile, and misjudgment had consequences beyond the visual. Vibrancy, while admired in moderation, demanded restraint. A single bloom of striking hue could draw attention and suggest vitality or passion. When repeated too frequently, however, the same color became assertion, a proclamation rather than suggestion. Observers noted the intensity, interpreting it as eagerness, or worse, impropriety. What had once conveyed skill now hinted at overreach or social naivete. Quantity amplified effect. A bed overflowing with blooms suggested extravagance, but uncontrolled proliferation invited speculation. Too many flowers implied desire for admiration rather than subtle communication. Observers judged abundance as carefully as they did omission, discerning whether the household exercised control or surrendered to impulse. The garden revealed character through excess as clearly as through restraint. Placement could magnify intensity. A bloom positioned at the center of a prominent view or repeated along every path emphasized its presence beyond measure. Where restraint was expected, such repetition suggested insistence. The garden, intended to communicate with subtlety, risked overwhelming its audience. Observers could interpret loudness as arrogance, insecurity, or disregard for decorum. Timing remained a critical factor. Early or off-season blooms drew attention that might be interpreted as impatience or eccentricity. Late blooms could appear contrived, as though the household struggled to maintain significance. The careful rhythm that permitted communication without imposition was disrupted by timing that drew notice too insistently. Even excellence required moderation. The risk of loudness extended beyond visual impression. It altered perception of social competence. Households whose gardens appeared excessive were scrutinized. Visitors noted the discrepancy between display and household behavior, questioning judgment and refinement. Flowers that spoke too loudly threatened the credibility of the gardener and the authority of the hostess. Labor intensified the effect. When care was apparent in every corner, observers assumed both diligence and oversight. Excessive display, however, could betray effort that seemed frantic or ill-considered. The garden revealed not only intention, but discipline, and loudness suggested the latter was strained. What was meant to signal control risked exposing anxiety. Subtlety allowed social messaging to remain pliable. Loudness removed ambiguity. A bouquet that shouted approval, disapproval, or desire left little room for discretion. Misinterpretation became more likely, and the protective function of the garden was compromised. The household lost control of the narrative it sought to shape. What was intended as beauty became commentary without nuance. Correcting excess required tact. Adjustments in placement, pruning, or timing could restore balance, but abrupt change risked recognition. Observers might perceive revision as acknowledgement of error. Restoration of restraint needed to appear natural, effortless, and unremarked, preserving both dignity and social equilibrium. In the Gilded Age, loudness was a cautionary tale. The power of the garden depended upon subtlety, moderation, and deliberate restraint. Flowers that spoke too clearly or too insistently undermined the household's authority, distorted meaning, and invited judgment. Beauty without discretion risked spectacle, whereas mastery lay in communicating with elegance, silence, and control. The garden, when loud, reminded all that refinement was measured not only in appearance, but in restraint. In the Gilded Age, gardens were not only spaces of beauty, but also instruments of communication, and their language depended on literacy. Understanding the meaning encoded in color, placement, and arrangement required experience, attention, and training. Yet, as society shifted and the novelty of floral symbolism waned, the skill to read these subtle messages began to decline. What had once been intuitive became obscure, and the silent discourse of flowers was increasingly lost on the uninitiated. This decline was gradual. Younger generations, born into comfort rather than necessity, lacked the rigorous observation that had trained their forebears. They admired blooms, noted colors, and strolled along paths, yet often missed the nuance of intent. A rose placed deliberately to signal admiration might be seen only as ornament. Absence, omission, and restraint, once powerful communicators, became invisible to eyes untrained in the garden's conventions. The subtlety of arrangement demanded patience, attentiveness, and memory. Observers had to recall previous displays, note seasonal changes, and recognize shifts in emphasis to fully comprehend meaning. With each passing year, these habits were eroded by distraction, changing social priorities, and the simplification of domestic life. The art of silent communication lost its audience, leaving gardens as decorative spaces rather than mediums of nuanced interaction. Exotic imports, carefully timed blooms, and restrained color palettes continued to appear, yet their messages were less frequently understood. Where once a single lavender bloom suggested devotion or a careful placement of white flowers implied restraint, these gestures now passed largely unnoticed. Visitors admired beauty, yet the significance encoded in arrangement, rhythm, and repetition often went unperceived. The garden spoke, but fewer ears heard. The decline of literacy altered the function of the garden itself. What had been a site of social negotiation, subtle rivalry, and measured communication became primarily an aesthetic experience. Display retained importance, but its communicative power diminished. Households relied more on impression than message, and flowers became valued for appearance rather than nuance. Subtlety lost its urgency when the audience could not discern intent. This shift also affected social authority. Hostesses and gardeners, who had once guided observation and shaped perception through deliberate arrangement, found their efforts less consequential. The cues they relied upon to direct behavior, establish hierarchy, and communicate sentiment were increasingly ignored. Authority expressed through flora weakened as the interpretive skill necessary to perceive it declined. Laborers maintained appearances, Yet their work no longer conveyed meaning with the same precision. Pruning, timing, and placement continued to shape the landscape, but the messages they were designed to encode were often overlooked. The garden remained orderly, but it had lost its voice. Its influence was aesthetic, not social. Even for those fluent in the traditional language, the diminished literacy of others created uncertainty. Messages could no longer be assumed to be received as intended. Intentionality risked misinterpretation or invisibility. The garden's subtle power relied on shared understanding, and without that comprehension, the effects of arrangement, timing, and restraint were muted. The decline of floral literacy marked the end of an era. The Gilded Age garden, once a dynamic instrument of silent communication, became increasingly ornamental. Its language, rich, deliberate, and precise, persisted in practice for a few. Yet the audience for such eloquence was shrinking. Meaning, once cultivated and observed with care, faded quietly, leaving beauty intact but expression diminished. In the Gilded Age, literacy determined perception. As skill in reading the language of flowers waned, the garden's messages became veiled, subtlety lost, and the silent discourse that had defined refinement and discretion increasingly forgotten. The soil remained fertile. The blooms continued to flourish. Yet the conversation that had once animated the landscape grew quieter until only the most attentive could hear it speak. The Gilded Age garden, with its intricate arrangements and carefully chosen blooms, carried messages long after their creators had departed. Even when visitors had left and conversations had ceased, the landscape retained the echo of intention. Petals faded, paths endured, and soil preserved memory, offering a final testament to the silent discourse that had once animated every flower and border. In this quiet persistence, the garden became both archive and storyteller. Petals that remained after the peak of bloom continued to signal meaning. Their placement, color, and condition recalled prior intention, inviting reflection on the subtleties once observed. A wilted blossom might recall restraint. Absence suggested discretion, and deliberate alignment of species hinted at thoughtfulness. Even as time eroded freshness, the underlying message persisted, readable to those who remembered and perceptive to those trained to notice. Seasonal transition heightened this effect. As spring gave way to summer, the bright promise of early blooms softened into the steady maturity of late flowers. Colors faded gradually, yet their arrangement continued to assert structure and intention. Observers returning to the garden could trace the progression of care and design, perceiving intention through the rhythm of growth and decay. The garden recorded time and sentiment simultaneously. The persistence of meaning depended upon observation. Even absent the immediate presence of hosts or visitors, the garden continued to communicate. Paths guided the eye, directing attention to arrangements that once carried nuanced significance. Beds retained composition, highlighting priority or emphasis long after deliberate pruning had shaped them. Subtle alterations remained legible, ensuring that the conversation embedded in the landscape extended beyond immediate interaction. Silence became amplified in this post-bloom state. Without verbal reinforcement, the garden relied entirely on what remained visible. Observation became more attentive, reflection more deliberate. Visitors contemplated absence as much as presence, and memory shaped interpretation. The messages conveyed by petals and soil demanded mindfulness, rewarding patience and depth of attention. This residual language also functioned as record. Future caretakers, heirs, or visitors could discern patterns, continuity, and intention, even without guidance. The choices of color, placement, and timing persisted as evidence of refinement and discretion. Gardens became repositories of social memory, encoding etiquette, judgment, and sentiment in living form. In reading these traces, one engaged with the legacy of care and intention. The endurance of these signals reinforced the garden's authority. Even when direct observation or social scrutiny was absent, the landscape asserted its presence. Its discipline, precision, and subtlety remained evident, creating continuity between generations. The garden instructed through its residue, reminding observers that meaning endured beyond immediate interaction. Labor, though now invisible, had left its imprint. Pruning, planting, and careful arrangement had created structures capable of sustaining message beyond their moment of execution. This persistence elevated the garden from mere display to instrument of enduring communication. Each petal, each border, each carefully considered space became a fragment of a larger, lasting dialogue. In the end, the Gilded Age garden spoke across absence and time. Petals, after silence, carried the intentions, judgments, and emotions of those who had shaped them, preserving meaning where words could not. They offered lessons in restraint, discernment, and observation. They demonstrated that beauty could endure while continuing to communicate, that silence could be as eloquent as speech, and that even after the moment had passed, the garden remained a witness, a teacher and a storyteller of subtle social grace.